Sacrificing Families by Leisy Abrego. Chapter 1. The Salvadoran Transnational Families. At 16 years old, Daniel was only about 4 feet, 8 inches tall. His faded school uniform, bony arms exposed was evidence of his family's dire economic situation. We spoke for over an hour in an empty, dusty room in the public school he attended in San Salvador. El Salvador, tears welled up in his eyes as he passionately described his father's many failed attempts to cross into the United States and the injustices he faced during U.S. detention. Daniel was most emotional, though, when he reflected on how the situation affected him personally. With tears streaming down his face, he admitted that he had even considered suicide. Daniel had not seen his father, Rodrigo, in years without the financial support the family hoped would come from Rodrigo's migration. They were overwhelmed by poverty, unable to make enough money to eat 3 meals a day. Daniel, a once promising student, was frequently going to school hungry. At school, he tried to focus on the subjects that were once so exciting to him, but stress overcame him, and high grades eluded him. And to make matters worse, malnutrition had stunted his growth to the point that fellow schoolmates regularly made fun of him. "At your height, you should be in kindergarten." Daniel remembered them taunting. "I feel so bad, so ashamed. I should be taller. I should be stronger, but life has been bad to me." Across the city, in a spacious home with modern appliances, I interviewed 21-year-old Xiomara. She was dressed fashionably with dangling earrings and carefully applied makeup that completed her reserved yet confident personality. Her mother, who had always been closest to her closest confidant, had migrated to the United States 3 years earlier, following the 2001 earthquakes. The natural disaster was devastating for her family. Xiomara's mother lost all the merchandise in her neighborhood store and acquired an immense debt overnight. Migration became the only realistic solution to their financial problems. With 3 years separation, the consistent monthly sums from her mother had reduced the debt while allowing Xiomara to graduate from a private high school and excel at a private university. She looked forward to completing a college degree in a few years and was generally optimistic about her future. But financial stability came at great emotional cost. As she reflected on the family separation, she articulated the great tension that weighed her down. "Given the context, let's say that it's going well. The only thing is my mother's companionship. That's something no one can replace," unquote. The transnational family strategy is at its core a response to economic circumstances. Parents migrate in search of better wages to send as remittances to their children. Collectively, remittances have become a mainstay of the national economies of several developing nations, including El Salvador. Migrants work hard to send sums of money that add up to relatively stability for their country as a whole. At a more intimate level, remittances are also this realization of a family survival strategy. Amid dire situations, migration became the most plausible solution for parents. They left children behind because they were hopeful that opportunities for work and higher wages would allow them to sacarlos adelante, uplift their families from afar. But not all families fare equally well. Some, like Xiomara, can thrive. They have access to greater academic opportunities and live more comfortably than ever before, even if they have to pay an emotional cost for such stability. Others, like Daniel, cannot catch a break. Here, too, children miss their parents terribly, but they have nothing concrete to show for the family sacrifice. This book examines why they are why there are desperate experiences of family separation. It uncovers some of the ways U.S. immigration policies and multiple gendered processes intersect and move fluidly across national borders to stratify transnational families, creating differential economic and emotional experiences for both parents and children. In the 21st century, transnational families are not uncommon among U.S. immigrants from Latin America. Thousands of migrant parents negotiate family life and responsibilities across borders, yet it's rare to hear people discuss the challenges openly and lovingly in shared community spaces. This is precisely what happened in May of 2003, when I sat in the audience at an art space in Los Angeles to witness the coming together of several artists who, like me, are children of Central American immigrants. Among the various moving performances about ethnic identity and the ever-present search for home, the piece titled Prosperity was especially touching. In it, Salvadoran writer, filmmaker, and performance artist Carolina Rivera portrayed the role of an immigrant mother in Los Angeles whose children remain in El Salvador. With limited props, she transported the audience into the world of this mother who lived by herself in a tight studio apartment with few belongings. Rivera poignantly revealed the economic and emotional pain of family separation through this mother who sacrificed a great deal in the United States, a country where she felt extremely lonely. She found courage and energy in knowing that at least her family in El Salvador was doing well, but the painful separation most evident when she received graduation photographs of her children, whom she no longer recognized. Much of the audience was in tears. In the decade that has followed, transnational families have appeared more frequently in U.S. political discourse and been more visible in the public eye. In the spring of 2006, hundreds of thousands of immigrants and their supporters marched in cities throughout the United States advocating for immigration reform. Los Angeles, home to the largest concentration of Latin American and El Salvadorian immigrants, witnessed two of the most massive demonstrations in 4 miles spanning Pico Union to Miracle Mile. The record-breaking multitude flowed through the city streets carrying signs calling for legalización para en los indocumentados, reunification, familiar, soluciones humanas para problemas humanos, legalization for the undocumented family, reunification, humane solutions for human problems. The historic marches helped suspend a draconian immigration bill in Congress, but the issue of family reunification, articulated so vividly in these documents, continues to be at the heart of Latino immigrants' daily struggles. Representations of transnational families have also captured the hearts and minds of moviegoers and readers. The movie Baja La Misma Luna, Under the Same Moon, portrayed the heartbreaking experiences of a Mexican transnational family, and the best-selling nonfiction book Enrique's Journey documents the agonizing attempt of a Honduran boy to reunite with his mother. Like these portrayals, Sacrificing Families also captures the tragedy of these families' living arrangements, but it delves deeper and uses a wider lens to situate transnational families in a larger structural context and to shed light on the patterns of inequality in their well-being. Why do parents choose to leave their children? What are these families' experiences of long-term separation, and why do some fare better than others? Transnational families and inequalities. It is not immediately evident why discrepancies arise in transnational families' well-being. From the work of various scholars, it is clear that most transnational families seek migration and family separation as survival strategies. that take advantage of global inequalities in wages. Mothers and fathers practice parenting from afar through remittances, gifts, and weekly phone calls. Children play a role in supporting or challenging these arrangements, and the bulk of the care work in both sending and receiving regions falls on women. It is still unclear, however, whether and why some transnational families fare better than others. As a first step, in examining inequalities, scholars have uncovered transnational families' internal discrepancies in quality of life and subjective experience of time apart. In her important study of Mexican transnational families, for example, sociologist Joanna Dreby teases out some central incongruities within these families, particularly how time flies for migrant parents who work long hours in the United States, but go slowly for children who grow up awaiting reunification with their parents. This mismatched in time leads to painful and prolonged separations when families yearn to be reunited. Sociologist Leah Schmalzbauer points to another internal inequality as seen in the class formation of migrant Honduran parents and their non-migrant children. While parents live in poverty to remit, their children use remittances to attain more comfortable lifestyles, not willing to share the details of their sacrifices so as not to worry their children. Parents inadvertently create superficial prosperity that their children come to expect, no matter how unrealistic its maintenance. These are important details about the experience of family separation across borders, but their emphasis on inequalities within transnational families largely misses the structural forces that contextualize family separation in the first place. This book aims to extend the vibrant scholarly discussion on transnational families by examining inequalities across transnational families. What are the various patterns of inequalities and differentiated experiences of transnational families? And what process create and sustain these? One logical place to begin this inquiry is in the work of international migration scholars who examine why some immigrants fare better than others in the United States. Three of the most commonly cited explanations for inequalities in socioeconomic integration of immigrants are human capital. Quote, the skills that immigrants bring along in the form of education, job experience, and language knowledge, social networks, and length of residence in the receiving country, how much they know, whom they know, and how long they've lived here, all help determine how quickly and how favorably immigrants move up economically in the United States. With higher levels of education, for example, immigrants should qualify for better paying jobs. The more friends and relatives they know in the United States, the more people they can rely on to help them find housing and work. And the longer they live here, the more they have learned about how to navigate opportunities and challenges in this country. By extension, these factors should also explain transnational family members' economic well-being. Like other immigrants, parents in transnational families rely on economic opportunities in the United States. The difference, however, is that much of their earnings is earmarked for remittances. Those remittances, in turn, make up the majority of their family's monthly budget in the home country. One way to examine inequalities across transnational families, therefore, is to focus on variations in the flow of remittances. In the Salvadoran case, scholars and practitioners in the field of development certainly look closely at the macro portrait of remittances. Collectively, international migrants reliably send portions of their wages to loved ones on their home countries, establishing what some see as migration development nexus. Indeed, some policymakers are pursuing the idea of using these monies for development. This makes sense considering that in 2012, remittances to Latin America totaled nearly $64 billion. to $3.9 billion, of which went to El Salvador. These monies are a significant source of external funding. They exceed the combined sum of foreign direct investment and official development assistance to several Latin American countries, including El Salvador. From the perspective of government entities and aid institutions, remittances are untaxed, quote, free funds that should be used more productively for national development. This book argues that part of the problem with this approach is that not all migrants remit evenly, and not all recipients benefit equally. An analytical lens that focuses on inequalities across transnational families will demonstrate that the efforts of governments, the banking industry, and non-governmental organizations, NGOs, to streamline the uses of remittances cannot presume a minimum baseline for any family. Furthermore, is it fair to expect transnational families to bear the burden of development? Although these families often conceive of separation as mostly an economic strategy, the realities of long-term separation also have profound, undeniable emotional effects on parents and children. Like most families, transnational families are expected to provide emotional support for their members, but the geographical distance between parents and children can make it very difficult to demonstrate love. Children are especially pained by their mother's absence, but do other dynamics also shape their emotional well-being? What are the effective tolls on various members of these families? And under what circumstances do some children learn to cope with long-term separation? Because the emotional consequences of a parent's absence may lower academic achievement, it is important to understand differences in emotional well-being and the processes that contextualize these patterns. The work of bringing in the state to explore intimate and gendered aspects of migration is already underway. In her beautifully written analysis of transnational Mexicans, anthropologist Deborah Bohm uncovers the multifaceted ways that U.S. policies produce and reproduce family intimacy and gendered experiences of transnational life. As she traces the shifts in gender ideologies and practices with every migration and return, Bohm underscores the fluid nature of these processes, even within single families. Similarly, geographer Geraldine Pratt compelling reveals the roles of Canadian policies in forcing Filipino families apart. In this case, the distance that separates migrants and their children proves to be quite painful and negatively consequential, even though what are deemed just temporary separations. In Sacrificing Families, I draw on and extend these rich insights to better understand economic and emotional inequalities across transnational families. I demonstrate that beyond the most widely cited explanations of why immigrants fare as they do, immigration policies and gender are also influential and complementary processes that complicate, amplify, and sometimes trump the effects of more traditional explanatory factors. That is, level of education, social networks, and length of residency. A lens that focuses specifically on immigration policies and gender, therefore, reveals a more complete picture of why some families fare better than others. The production of legality. Although public debates about immigration in the United States implicitly assume that immigrants' legal status is an innate and statistic characteristic, the truth is that nothing about an immigrant's position within or outside of the law is natural. On the contrary, illegality, the condition of immigrants' legal status and deportability, is historically specific and socially, politically, and legally produced. In its contemporary form, illegality has come to have an intimate and deep impact on all immigrants, as the potential for deportation is high, even if it is impossible to deport all undocumented immigrants. With very restricted paths to legalization, undocumented immigrants and their loved ones must grapple with the fear of deportation at every turn. This is a heavy burden that millions carry. There have been moments in U.S. history when, in practical terms, undocumented status had little meaning. For various periods of mass immigration, undocumented immigrants were able to obtain a driver's license and work without the intense fear of deportation that now permeates immigrant communities. But in the last few decades, undocumented status and illegality have gained broader significance. Immigrants categorized as undocumented or temporarily protected are targets of progressively more harsh laws and ever more hateful speech, all of which work together to criminalize and dehumanize them and their families. Beginning in the 1980s, at approximately the same time that massive migration of Salvadorans began, the United States changed its contemporary immigration enforcement policies, no longer focusing only on relatively inconsequential apprehensions at the border. The Reagan administration militarized border enforcement. These changes thwarted circular migration patterns and increased the settlement of entire families in the United States. For Salvadorans who had to travel through multiple border crossings passing through Guatemala and Mexico en route to the United States, the new border policies added yet another layer of barriers between migrants and their families. The Reagan administration also gave states more power to implement migration policies locally, and with the passage of the Immigration Reform and Control Act, IRCA, in 1986 established high symbolic employer sanctions that for the first time made it a crime for undocumented migrants to work. These changes set in motion the production of illegality. I can't say that word, I'm sorry. In its current form. Immigrants were further disadvantaged through the congressional overhaul of immigration law in 1996. With the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act, IRA, along with increasing border enforcement, the new law made it more difficult for immigrants to obtain legal permanent residence. It eliminated legal mechanisms previously available to immigrants who were fighting deportation and also made legal permanent residence deportable, even retroactively. For a vastly expanded set of non-criminal offenses, as a result, deportation have markedly increased every year since after the 9/11 legal changes to criminalize undocumented immigrants further magnified and accelerated when the Immigration and Naturalization Service, INS, was reorganized into the Department of Homeland Security with the purpose of safeguarding the country against terrorism. This move explicitly linked immigrants with criminal at a time when programs such as the 287G, in which local police are deputized to act as Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, agents, and secure communities, which allows the FBI to communicate to ICE about anyone arrested or booked into custody throughout the country, increase their chances of deportation. Indeed, such programs have led to record numbers of detention and deportations through sweeping workplace raids, and because even routine traffic stops can quickly lead to ICE's involvement. Although undocumented status has until recently been largely a matter of civil or administrative law, mainstream media images tend to portray undocumented immigrants as criminals. The image of undocumented immigrants at the moment of apprehension handcuffed and treated as dangerous felons, is common on network news. These repeated images are rather convincing to the general public, even when officials' statistics confirm that the majority of immigrants who are deported do not have criminal records. The record numbers of deportations, alongside the wave of hate speech and growing animosity against immigrants, inevitably affect immigrants and their families' well-being. Whether or not all members are undocumented, contemporary immigrants have made a home and settled in the United States under this cloud of illegality. Meanwhile, employers who have little to risk under the selective enforcement of the law willingly hire undocumented immigrants, usually as low-wage workers and easy targets for exploitation. Knowing that workers have everything to lose if they are detained and deported, unscrupulous employers threaten to call ICE as a way to control employees and undermine their rights. Beyond work sites, illegality is a central determinant of immigrants' life chances. Undocumented immigrants are marginalized by their legal non-existence. From their position outside the law, they are more likely than other immigrants to earn less and work in more dangerous jobs and have little access to financial and housing aid. Deportations, however, have devastating consequences for families and entire communities. And even when immigrants are not detained, undocumented status prolongs their economic insecurity, while ramped up enforcement practices produce mental anguish when they know that they may be deported at any moment in any public or private space. It is important that the fear of detention and deportation powerfully regulates immigrants' behavior, often impeding them from having access to their legal rights as workers and human beings, and preventing them from seeking social services. As policies continue to criminalize immigrants and block them from work and educational opportunities, legal statuses as determined by immigration laws set the conditions for vast inequalities for immigrants. Over the long term, these disadvantages can prevent undocumented immigrants from thriving economically and integrating socially into the United States, while their families and communities experience the ripple effects. Drawing on research on illegality, this book examines how the production of illegality in the United States, a country that is undeniably both a regional and world center of power, also determines the life chances and well-being of people beyond its territorial borders, from determining who is eligible for a visa and who can regularize his or her status to how long immigrants must wait to file a petition for their close relatives to join them in county. Policies and enforcement practices produce illegality with consequences that are not easily contained by borders. The production of gender. Gender is an equally important factor for the well-being of immigrants and their families. Indeed, it is a central constitutive element in all human life. Gender ideologies, structures, and practices operate simultaneously to shape women's and men's opportunities and behaviors within families, labor markets, and other social institutions and spaces. Fluidly, gender is produced through ongoing, ever-present processes that convincingly suggest that the common and seemingly persistent behaviors considered acceptable for girls and boys, women and men at any given moment in history are natural and normal. Gendered inequalities, therefore, often go unquestioned when people assume these patterns to be unchangeable. This can make deep-seated inequalities, including that the uneven burden of childcare and higher moral expectations for women and greater pay and decision-making power for men, difficult to erase even across national contexts. Parenthood and its practices are heavily marked by gendered opportunities and expectations. While family practices are ever-changing, motherhood and fatherhood are often defined in sharply contrasting ways. In El Salvador, motherhood is venerated as the idolized form of womanhood, while fatherhood is only one of several acceptable forms of masculinity, defined culturally as morally superior to fathers. Mothers are expected to sacrifice themselves in the name of their families. These sacrifices can mean different things to different sectors of the population. While middle and upper class mothers are charged with being the main caregivers of their families within homes, poor and working class mothers must also participate in the public sphere through employment in the labor market, political action, or migration to support their children. Fatherhood, on the other hand, regardless of social class standing, is closely tied to authority, protection, and guidance of the family through participation in the public sphere. Structural barriers and socioeconomic inequalities can prevent poor and working class parents from fulfilling their social expectations in the context of economic precariousness. Mothers are additionally burdened by social surveillance. Gossip and negative interactions with others can serve to police mothers into fulfilling their expected roles as self-sacrificing providers, regardless of the scarcity around them. In those instances, marginalized and economically disadvantaged women may have only their own bodies as workers, protesters, or migrants to offer in the name of children's survival. Economically disadvantaged fathers, on the other hand, may also be targets of gendered forms of gossip, but these do not necessarily undermine their masculinity and self-worth. As men, when they are structurally blocked from economic sources of masculine identity, they can negotiate and maintain their masculinity through the other means, including repressing emotions, demonstrating physical strength, or signaling freedom and sexual prowess. These structural and cultural contexts help to explain why mothers who transgress gender boundaries by migrating internationally may still conform to gender norms in other ways. They also suggest reasons why, despite the existence of a law in El Salvador that defines irresponsible paternity as a crime, many fathers forego their paternal responsibilities without strict enforcement of the law. That stakes for meeting these expectations are low. Socially, it becomes acceptable for fathers who cannot provide economically for their children to establish their self-worth by performing more easily attainable forms of masculinity, including independence, stoicism, or sexual relations with multiple women. Meanwhile, migrant women face greater stigma and more meaningful punishment than men from transgressing parental gender boundaries. Unlike migrant fathers, migrant mothers throughout the world are persistently stigmatized for leaving their children aside. Yet harsh and uneven economic conditions require that women continue to migrate. To be sure, migration and settlement have the potential to change women's and men's notions of what is appropriate gender behavior. Individuals may be forced to redefine their roles within families every time they migrate as they adapt to new contexts and changing responsibilities. Some immigrant women have gained independence, and immigrant men have taken on more chores at home. But such gendered negotiations are fraught, particularly as a result of gendered labor market opportunities and experiences. For transnational families, labor market inequalities are particularly consequential for remittances. In some cases, migrant men who earn more than women send larger sums. On the other hand, although women send smaller sums, they tend to be more consistent and reliable remitters. Structurally, it makes sense that immigrant women remit smaller sums because they typically earn less than men. Immigrant women and men have access to different kinds of jobs. Latina immigrant women are largely concentrated in menial, poorly paid jobs in the often exploitive social sector. And although immigrant men are also disadvantaged in the labor market, immigrant women systematically earn less and are hired into less prestigious jobs than their male counterparts with similar levels of education. In the rich structural and cultural contexts that produced gendered parental expectations, remittances offer a fruitful site for the examination of gendered agency, barriers, and production in transnational families. After all, remittances are more than mere economic markers. They represent a sense of obligation between family members and often the expression of deep emotional bonds between relatives across borders. This may explain why, in some instances, women have also been known to remit more than men. Such unlikely outcomes suggest the need for a more nuanced gendered analysis. In countries like El Salvador, where women as mothers, grandmothers, sisters, and other family relatives continue to be held responsible for the majority of mothering tasks, mothers' migrations are likely to have far-reaching consequences in families' lives. Indeed, the enormous emotional costs to family members have repeatedly surfaced as central components of the transnational family experience, particularly for families in which the mother has migrated. Meanwhile, constructions of masculinity prevent migrant men from expressing their melancholy and loneliness, making it difficult to stay in touch with their families when they cannot fulfill the various gendered expectations. This book examines how gendered structures, expectations, and processes help determine the economic and emotional well-being of transnational families in their efforts to support their families. How do migrant mothers and fathers practice agency to transgress, transform, or conform to gender expectation that mediate their family separations? Moreover, when and how does gender intersect illegality during the migration decision, journey, and settlement processes to shape transnational family members' experiences across borders? The Salvadorian context. I'm so sorry. The Salvadoran context. I chose to research Salvadoran transnational families for several reasons. Most important, this population has characteristics that help me understand inequalities across families. With a complicated history of blocked access to legal status in the United States and made up of similar numbers of men and women, the Salvadoran migration stream allows me to compare experiences across far-reaching systems of stratification, namely illegality and gender. This and the fact that Salvadoran immigrants are separated from their loved ones in El Salvador by multiple national borders makes Salvadoran case an important one for Latin American, U.S.-based transnational families. Massive migration of Salvadorans to the United States began in the early 1980s, mainly in response to civil war. Historically, the military used repressive and violent tactics to quash popular uprisings, always in the name of democracy, although mostly prioritizing the protection of wealth. By the late 1970s, when wide-scale poverty and repression had become unbearable, leftist factions joined forces in an armed struggle to overthrow oligarchy. Their goal was to finally put an end to the deep economic inequalities that benefited few while crippling the vast majority of the population. The U.S. role in supporting the military set the conditions for the immensely devastating consequences of the Civil War. Assuming that the armed leftist coalition represented the possibility of a much-feared communist victory in the region, as part of the Cold War operations, the Reagan administration armed and trained the Salvadoran military and paramilitary leaders of death squads with the goal of eliminating all opposition through any means necessary. To this end, in the 1980s, the U.S. government invested over $1 million daily, totaling $6 billion to maintain the war against guerrilla fighters in their attempts to suppress the popular armed movement of people who were demanding a decrease in extreme disparities and
an end to government repression. The U.S. trained and largely U.S.-funded military indiscriminately scorched entire villages while torturing and disappearing thousands. By the end of the war, at least 75,000 people were killed, while scores were disappeared, never to be heard from again. In response, those who lost relatives had survived attacks, lived in hard-hit zones, or simply feared imminent death fled. While some sought refuge, regionally a larger number headed north. For the first time in Salvadoran history, people migrated en masse to the United States, based on ties with family and friends or guided by notions they had learned through television and popular culture. They imagined the United States to be a safe and politically stable place with ample opportunities for economic advancement. Unfortunately, they were met with a blocked entrance despite the U.S. government's role in the war. It did not recognize Salvadorans as political refugees. According to the Refugee Act enacted by the U.S. government in 1980, individuals who are unable or unwilling to return to their country nationality because of persecution or well-founded fear of persecution on account of race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion may be granted refugee status or asylum in the United States. Migrants fleeing clearly recorded persecution in El Salvador therefore should have been accepted as refugees. Refugee status or asylum would have translated into a much more welcoming and stabilizing entrance for Salvadorans, thereby increasing their chances of thriving in the United States. Instead, the U.S. government failed to take responsibility for its role in the violence and devastations that pushed so many Salvadorans out of their country. And it deemed Salvadorans unwanted, unauthorized immigrants. This notably hostile context of reception, however, has done little to deter continued migration from the region. Although the war officially ended in 1992, the lack of the economic opportunities from the country, the enforcement of new neoliberal policies, and access to well-developed social networks between immigrants in the United States and their friends and relatives in El Salvador ensured a continued steady migration stream. Current estimates suggest that 20 to 35% of persons born in El Salvador have migrated mainly to the United States, making them one of the fastest growing immigrant groups. With a population of roughly 2 million, Salvadorans make up the third largest Latino group in the country and the second largest in California. This trend is likely to continue in large part due to the consequences of the Dominican Republic Central American Free Trade Agreement, CAFTA, DR, another U.S. endorsed policy that was signed into law in El Salvador in 2005, although supporters of CAFTA-DR promised that the legislation would create jobs, increase economic investment in Central America, and strengthen the relationship between Central American nations and the United States. So far, it has only exacerbated inequality in El Salvador, increased inflation, decreased jobs, deteriorated labor rates, and allowed less investment in social welfare programs. Under these conditions, it should be of no surprise that people will continue to seek survival elsewhere. Variety of legal statuses. Once Salvadoran migrants arrive in the United States, U.S. immigration laws and the legal statuses they confer have unequivocally extended their vulnerability. The Salvadoran experience, while similar in some ways to the more widely studied Mexican case, is also notably different and more reflective of smaller migrations from countries like Guatemala and Honduras. To this day, the U.S. government continues to refuse to recognize Salvadorans as victims of geopolitics, making them ineligible for most legal protections, by creating categories that are neither citizen or resident, but also not undocumented. The largest and most long-term of these categories is temporary protected status, TPS. Temporary protected status is a form of administrative relief that allows otherwise undocumented immigrants to legally reside and work in the United States for 18 months at a time. TPS is a result of Salvadoran immigrants and their allies' organized protests throughout the 1980s. Fewer than 3% of Salvadoran applicants were given political asylum. Faith-based and other immigrant rights groups organized and successfully lobbied on their behalf, convincing Congress to grant Salvadorans temporary protected status from deportation in 1990. In that instance, TPS ended in 1992 after the devastating earthquakes in Salvador in early 2001. However, TPS was once again made available to Salvadoran immigrants present and undocumented in the United States at the time. More than a decade later, the Secretary of Homeland Security has continued to extend TPS to those immigrants during each 18-month cycle. Immigrants wait anxiously for news about the program's reapproval to then re-register and pay associated fees. It is important to note that TPS still does not provide a path to legal residency. In 2010, roughly 20% of Salvadoran immigrants, only those who had been continuously present in the country since February 13, 2001, were eligible for TPS. Salvadoran immigrants who arrived after 2001 or who fell out of the TPS for various reasons are categorized as undocumented due to the difficulty of gaining access to this vulnerable population. It is unclear exactly how many Salvadorans are undocumented. Figures vary considerably from report to report and year after year to year. According to the most widely cited estimates, however, between 30 and 52% of Salvadorans in the United States are undocumented, and this proportion has grown quickly in recent years. There are immigrants who have managed through a number of complicated and ever-changing policies to legalize their status in the 1980s. For example, the legalization program under IRCA was available to a relatively small percentage of Salvadorans who arrived in the United States prior to the January 1st, 1982 deadline. The thousands who arrived during and after the height of the Civil War were ineligible. Another pathway to permanent legal residence came in 1990 as a result of the settlement of a class action suit, American Baptist Churches versus Thornburg ABC legislation against the Immigration and Naturalization Service. Salvadorans, along with the Guatemalans who faced similar levels of discrimination, were allowed to resubmit asylum application. This opened the path for a smaller sector of immigrants to achieve legalization in another legal fight. Some Salvadorans were able to benefit from the 1997 Nicaraguan Adjustment and Central American Relief Act, NACARA. Through all of these different measures, and especially through family reunification laws, by 2009, an estimated 31% of Salvadoran immigrants were legal permanent residents, LPRs, while another 18 to 30% were naturalized U.S. citizens. This variety of legal statuses, undocumented, temporarily protected, legal permanent resident, and U.S. citizen, provides a spectrum that captures some of the gray areas of immigrants' legal statuses. Moreover, there are frequent and important shifts in categories. Those who are in process to receive legal permanent resident status, those who are in process to qualifying for the latest round of TPS, and those who lose TPS and go back to being undocumented. Each of these categories and processes produces rights and limitations. However, academic and public conversations about immigration laws and legal categories are too often limited to documented versus undocumented. thereby missing much of the complexity of the system and the associated experiences for immigrants. The variety of legal statuses in the Salvadoran migration stream makes it possible to tease out the many ways legality shapes people's lives and stratifies families' well-being. Gender. The Salvadoran case also lends itself to understanding the ways that gender shapes transnational families' well-being. Contrary to long-held assumptions and patterns in other countries where most migrants are men, the Salvadoran migration stream includes women who led the way and migrate almost as often as men. Various factors, including the historic patterns of internal and regional cyclical migration, the high rates of female-headed households, and the increase in domestic and other service employment sectors in the United States, created the conditions that ultimately facilitated women's and mothers' migration out of El Salvador. Migration and family separation have been central to the Salvadoran experience for over a century, as aptly synthesized by the sociologist Cecilia Minerva. Salvadorans in rural areas started practicing seasonal internal migration beginning in the mid-late to late 1800s, when they sought work in a coffee production. By the mid-1920s, landless Salvadorans were migrating internationally to work in the banana industry in neighboring Honduras, with small number of elites making their way to vacation in the United States through the mid-20th century. The persistent migration patterns significantly shaped social life and relationships in rural El Salvador, as Minerva describes the marginal conditions of life for these workers, and their perpetual pilgrimage gave rise to a high percentage of free unions and an accompanying increase in the number of illegitimate children. Given a situation in which men had to move temporarily or permanently in search of work, the increased participation of women in public life and in the labor force comes as no surprise. Because of men's extremely low incomes as wage laborers, women were often left in charge of the households and also engaged in paid work in a variety of subsistence activities. Thus, it was not uncommon for women to become the sole providers of a household. The political scientist Karen Kampworth also notes that El Salvador has had high rates of female-headed households and female participation in the labor force since the 1950s, when global consumption of coffee, sugar, and bananas increased. Corrupt political leaders confiscated the land of the poor, thereby forcing impoverished men to search for seasonal work in different regions of Central America. In that process, when initiated as temporary migration, often becomes permanent when men abandoned their families for new partners. Salvadoran families were further fractured through the devastation of the Civil War. Here, too, working-class women became more likely to join the labor force for subsistence. Historically, then, Salvadoran poor and working-class women have commonly worked outside the home, migrated to cities for employment opportunities, and become more involved in organizing collectively for subsistence and social justice. Indeed, there is a tradition of women leading political movements and joining collective action in pursuit of social change in El Salvador. In these processes, motherhood and femininity have been negotiated and renegotiated to include not just the experience of bearing children, but also defending them and oneself against state repression, and blurring public and private lines to provide for themselves and their children in the most difficult of economic contexts. These multidimensional definitions of motherhood in turn allowed poor and working class women to consider international migration by themselves as an option for feeding their families. Salvadoran and other Central American poor and working class men, on the other hand, have historically faced structural blocks to achieving masculinity as providers According to a Nicaraguan researcher, Maria Angelica Fom, among men's limited options, procreation represents the social legitimation of masculine identity. The proof of virility to all society is that a man has the means to make women pregnant, since the necessary and sufficient proof of masculinity is, in the strictest sense, the pregnancy almost more than the children. This explains not only the high fertility level that persists in a broad sector of women, but also the significance of or meaning of the children and of paternity itself. In that context, El Salvador has the highest rate of female-headed households in Central America, 31%, suggesting that getting women pregnant is a more important source for establishing masculinity than hands-on parenting. Many men, driven by economic opportunities, by gender norms, are likely to move around and become absent fathers, leaving women to be heads of households. It is not surprising then that when service jobs targeting women with little formal education, such as domestic work, garment work, and hotel housekeeping, began to rise in the United States, Salvadoran women's history of working in the paid labor force set the stage for the massive international migration of women. Prior to the Civil War, for example, domestic workers employed by U.S. government officials or U.S. company representatives in El Salvador were recruited to join employers on their return to the United States. For male and female workers employed in U.S.-owned assembly plants in El Salvador in the 1970s, moreover, their transferable skill and knowledge about opportunities abroad made migration an attractive option. Little by little, men and women trickled into the United States. In many of these cases, Salvadoran women were leaders of migration streams, and their flow remains close behind that of the males. Nationally, it is estimated that the Salvadoran population in the United States consists of 52.6% males and 47.3% females. Although the history of gendered migration to the United States varies across countries, as more women migrate from Mexico to Central America, the Salvadorian case sheds light on potential experiences of family separation, given the stratified opportunities and varying expectations for male and female immigrants of any country. These gendered differences in structural barriers provide an important backdrop on which to understand inequalities across transnational families, economic and emotional well-being. The people and their stories. I draw on the narratives of many people to tell the complicated stories of how illegality and gender shape transnational families. The pages of this book are filled with the voices of children and parents who have been apart from their loved ones for long periods of time, no less than 3 years and up to 27 years. In El Salvador, the adolescents and young adults were children of migrant mothers and fathers. In some cases, only their mother or only their father migrated. In others, both parents live in the United States. Their living situations and caregivers vary. Some live with only their mother, others with grandparents, aunts or godmothers, and others yet reside with other siblings. Their level of resources ranges greatly, and this is based almost entirely on how much money they receive from their migrant parents. Like most Salvadoran remittance recipients, many received an average of $100 each month. But there is great variation, with some receiving over 10 times that amount and others receiving nothing. During interviews, children of migrants often cried. They wanted to talk about their experiences because, surprisingly, in a country where family separation due to migration is common, they felt they had few opportunities to share their thoughts about their parents' absence. Teachers and school administrators knew about the number of children number of students in this situation and the effects of family separation on the children's educational achievements in the short and long term. But the institutions did not acknowledge transnational families. The curriculum and the school calendar of events were silent on this issue, and there was no official space where students could seek support. Several students were taken aback by the number of hands, sometimes more than half, that went up in their classrooms when during my presentations I asked if anyone's parents lived in the United States. Many confided about missing their parents and how growing up with other relatives was their sense of normalcy. Yet they did not feel comfortable discussing this with peers or teachers. Many felt deeply isolated because only siblings and the closest of friends had heard the stories they shared during conversations with me. In the United States, the mothers and fathers worked mostly in the service sector as domestic and garment workers, hotel housekeepers, nurses, aides, street vendors, restaurant servers, cooks, janitors, mechanics, construction workers, community organizers, and upholstery workers. Most lived in the greater Los Angeles area, but four were in the greater Boston area, and a couple lived in Dallas. Although the majority of these families had few resources and lived in poor neighborhoods, some owned homes and had moved up into the bottom rungs of the middle class. They usually left their children in El Salvador with the genuine expectation that they would continue to be involved in parenting from afar. Although a few did admit that after several years they had lost touch with their loved ones, most remained in contact with their children. With few exceptions, these immigrant parents planned to live in the United States for the rest of their lives. Unsurprisingly, interviews were often painful for parents. Many recalled in great detail the day they said goodbye to their children and the challenges they had faced since leaving. Understandably, most regarded their migration as a sound decision, particularly when they had been successful in sending money and improving their children's material lives. But even parents whose families were not faring particularly well believed that, given the dismal economic situations in El Salvador, they were still better off than if they had stayed. For many of them, even those who often talked to their co-workers and friends about their children, the interview was an opportunity to take a brief break from their strenuous lives to reflect on their trajectories before and after migration. Gathering their stories. I gathered the stories of the families through casual conversations with an observations of El Salvadorians in El Salvador, and the United States. Because of this prevalence of transnational families in Salvadoran society and their notoriety in public discourse, everyone seemed to have strong opinions about my research topic. In restaurants, stores, hometown association meetings, community organization, lobbies, and various social events, whenever I mentioned my research project, people readily shared their experiences and thoughts. In El Salvador, my strategy was to recruit high school and college students in diverse neighborhoods, so I also spoke to teachers and school administrators who had much to say on this topic. They saw the ups and downs of students struggling to adjust to family separation and knew the situation to be common. But the book draws most heavily from the 130-inch in-depth interviews that I conducted between June 2004 and September 2006 with parents and children who are members of the transnational families. In 10 cases, I was able to interview parents and children from the same family. The rest of the people in the study are parents in the United States and children in El Salvador who are members of transnational families, but who are not related to one another. To capture perspectives of long-term separation, I included only families who had been apart for 3 or more years. My analysis is based mostly on people's narratives. This means that I am relying on the versions of their lives as people imagine them. While their truths may have multiple interpretations, and I believe there is value in each of those individual interpretations, here I am interested in the patterns that emerge across people's narratives. These patterns are what reveal the collective understanding and construction of social categories, including motherhood, fatherhood, transnational families, remittance receiver, visa authorized traveler, and undocumented immigrant. Because I was interested in comparing the experiences by gender of the migrant parent, for example, I recruited similar numbers of mothers and fathers, and in the United States I interviewed 47 parents, 25 mothers, and 22 fathers with various immigration statuses whose average age at the time of the interview was 40 years old. These immigrants had been living in the United States and therefore had been separated from their children for an average of 11 years. The single session interviews lasted between 1 and 3 hours to capture a variety of experiences. I recruited participants in numerous locations and through different entry points in Los Angeles. I visited and approached potential participants at business, churches, union halls, day labor sites, public parks, and community-based organizations. Interviewees helped me locate other migrant parents, including 2 in Dallas, Texas, and 4 in the greater Boston area. In El Salvador, I conducted interviews with 83 relatives of migrants. Of these, 3 were caregivers and 80 were adolescents and young adult children. Through trial and error, I learned that the most effective recruiting strategy was to visit high schools and colleges in search of children of migrants to include diverse experiences. I located and interviewed participants in a number of institutions that ranged from impoverished semi-rural public schools to wealthy urban private schools in both high school and college. Here too, interviewees helped me locate more participants, including non-students whom I interviewed in their homes and at their places of work. Respondents resided in different departments of El Salvador, but most lived in urban areas of San Salvador. The average age of participants at the time of the interview was 17 years old, with a range from 14 to 29. The average length of their parents' residence in the United States, and therefore the average length of family separation, was 9.4 years. Because gender is one of the central concerns of the book, the sample includes the experiences of 29 children in families in which the mother migrated to the United States, 38 in which the father migrated, and 13 in families with 2 migrant parents. This allowed me to compare their experiences based on who migrated in their household. The variety in their parents' legal statuses also permitted an analysis of illegality. The single session interviews lasted between 45 and 90 minutes. During semi-structured interviews, we spoke about several topics, including reasons for migration, the best and worst aspects of family separation, differences in family members' lives since they had separated, and advice they would share with others who may be considering this strategy. Although in El Salvador, families of undocumented migrants were sometimes hesitant to talk to me, as were a few undocumented immigrants in Los Angeles. Overall, my social location is as a female 1.5 generation Salvadoran immigrant in the United States helped me gain the trust of study participants. In Los Angeles, mothers and fathers often understood their participation as a way to help me attain my goal of an advanced degree. Given the low levels of formal schooling among Salvadoran immigrants, they expressed pride in my academic accomplishments and were happy to contribute. In El Salvador, people participated out of a sense of curiosity. The fact that I lived in the United States indirectly drew them to me in hopes of learning more about the place where their migrant parents reside. Finding respondents was not always easy, however, and interviews brought out deep pain for many. When there was hesitation, the patterns I noticed among legal status and gender lines are what alerted me to the importance of these factors. When they eventually opened up, most respondents expressed gratitude for the opportunity to say out loud the many thoughts and aspirations they carry with them. Learning from the Salvadoran case, migration borders and remittances, the Salvadoran case is interesting and important for a number of reasons. Over the last 3 decades, the out-migration of Salvadorans has increased so dramatically that its effect arguably reaches all aspects of social life. In El Salvador, for families, this has meant that in some regions of the country, as many as 16 and even up to 40% of children grow up without one or both parents due to migration. Nationally, about 12% of children live this way. As peripheral nations like El Salvador continue to participate in globalization through the export of its labor force, Salvadoran patterns may shed light on the increasing rates of family separation due to migration around the world. Salvadoran immigrants and transnational families are also notable for their lengthy separations. Unlike the more widely studied Mexican-U.S. case, the Salvadoran migration stream is characterized by multiple borders that separate the sending and receiving region. Given the high percentage of undocumented and otherwise legally precarious migrants, multiple national borders have made circular migration almost impossible for Salvadorans throughout their history of migration to the United States. Similar to most any other largely unauthorized Latin American U.S. migration stream, transnational Salvadoran parents may go for many years without visiting or reuniting with their children. Under these circumstances, it does not always make sense to think transnational families as single units that happen to be spread out spatially between the destination and home countries. In the Salvadoran case, to interpret transnational families is unproblematic. Split households that maintain communication seamlessly through electronics is to dismiss the painful reality in their day-to-day lives and in their patterned behaviors, where it is evident that each individual family member is discreetly present in a single and faraway space relative to loved ones. Therefore, in the midst of long-term separation, even when their actions and hopes connect them to each other, they must proceed, often only tentatively, with their own lives each day while planning for their family's future. Excelling in school, building ties with local communities, making solid plans, all of these crucial activities may become quite difficult to carry out when family members feel their lives suspended by unfulfilled hopes and blocked paths to reunification. Families all around the world are expected to provide much of the emotional and economic support necessary for children's healthy development. Likewise, immigrants would often like to rely on families for support and a sense of continuity through the migration and settlement processes. Transnational Salvadoran families are no different in these respects. Parents make the decision within a set of limited options to pursue migration as a way to provide for their children. They are hopeful at the outset, but not everyone is successful in the face of increasingly lengthy and geographically distant separations. Sacrificing Families examines how transnational family members experience these expectations and why, in the long run, some families fare better than others. As free trade agreements continue to expand and exacerbate global inequalities, and as nation states open doors widely for products and profits while closing them tightly for refugees and labor migrants, these types of families are not only becoming more common, but they are also living through lengthier separations. This book gives voice to these immigrants and their families and documents the inequalities across their experiences. This is the end of chapter 1. Thank you.